Hello, and welcome to Painting 2 or Painting Three's 101 Contemporary Painters Survey Part 2. This is for Clark College and is a continuation of Part 1. You can find corresponding names of artists on your slide sheet on Canvas. We'll start today's talk with John Curran. Curran is very famous for his figurative works, like this piece right here, and his reference to art history both through the content of his work, his compositions, and his technique. You can kind of see that in this pseudo old master method that he's using with this image. Now, I should say that personally, Curran was an artist that I really disliked when I was in undergrad. I really thought that a lot of his kind of sexy imagery, like this slide right here, were a little over the top and something that I just wasn't that interested in. I thought that they were kind of obvious in this bad boy image sort of way. But as I've grown older and as his work has changed and matured, I've actually really come to appreciate some of his attempts as a painter to both challenge expectations and also make some honest work. That said, I still don't particularly care for this image. Lisa Yuskevich is an artist who is often clumped together with John Curran because of their similar approach to sexualized subject matter and the female form. Of course, a major difference between Yuskevich and Curran is that Yuskevich is a woman. And so a lot of her analysis, painterly analysis of beauty standards and the female form are from the perspective of her own body, which changes things a great deal. Similar to Curran, though, we see an approach to painting that is beholden to kind of a neoclassical approach to underpainting, light and texture, surface description, and brushstroke. We definitely see this kind of very specific to a Renaissance, Baroque, or Rococo styling here in this painting. Some of her new work has become even more overt in its references to pornographic imagery and the way that women are depicted within it. It's kind of unclear from an image like this one whether or not she is opposing that objectification or contributing to it, which has been one of the criticisms of Yuskevich and Curran throughout, is that it's hard to decide whether or not they are commenting on or helping to aid in the objectification of the female form. A British painter who really must be discussed if we're talking about figurative work in the 20th and 21st century is Jenny Saville. This painting, called Prop, from the 1990s, is indicative of some of her very early work that was immediately made her an art star. I think her first show out of school at Gagosian Gallery sold out or something like that. And she is a phenomenal painter. The scale of this work is massive. These are really big paintings. And you can see her approach to the figure, wherein she is really, this is a pseudo self-portrait, and she's really approaching body image and beauty standards in a way that is kind of sometimes full of angst and self-doubt and anger. And so we kind of see some things etched back into the surface. This is a later painting by Jenny Saville of a carcass in the slaughterhouse. But we see a lot of similar approaches to painting method. One of the things that I really love about Saville's surfaces is the way that she so seamlessly blends what we could describe as a very painterly brushstroke, almost an abstract surface, with crisp, bold decision making when it comes to representation. So we have this great reflection in the floor underneath this carcass that just really stands out as quote unquote real. Eric Fischl is an American painter who gained a lot of notoriety in the 1980s for these kind of scenes of the dark side of suburbia. This painting, called Sleepwalker, is really indicative of that time. We kind of see this undercurrent of sexuality and darkness inside a lot of the work from that time period, and this kind of spotlight on top of the figure. We can kind of contrast that image with this more recent work by Eric Fischl in some of the methods of preparation for making the painting. So in the 1980s, Fischl made a ton of drawings, and then he would kind of compose these paintings out of those drawn observations. And that's pretty different than how he's been making his paintings more recently, wherein he starts from a digital collage that he's worked in Photoshop. So that's how this painting was made. And I think we can, whether you prefer the one or the other, I think it's important to just note some of the distinctions and what that does to the quality of the image. This image, to my mind, feels a little stiffer than the previous image, but it also has a little bit more verisimilitude in terms of color matching and naturalism in terms of light. And that almost certainly is coming from that photographic reference, both the stiffness and the light. The work of Matthias V Share is a German painter. He's from that new Leipzig school that was mentioned a little bit by his teacher Neo Rau in the Contemporary Painters Part 1 presentation. And Weischer is this really remarkable interior painter who combines really realistic forms like the couch cushion leaning against the wall over there with a real approach to paint that is experimental and playful. We can see that he's using a squeegee for big sections of dragging wet paint for all that brown wall back there, the huge rainbow blend. And we kind of have this constructed space where we can really feel how each piece of the painting was put together. And there's a lot of playful back and forth of leaving things unfinished and yet allowing them to stay resolved within the painting. Another image by Weischer, his kind of interior exterior play and the way that the floor becomes the countertop, I think is an interesting commentary on the picture plane here and some of the illusions that painters take for granted. Christoph Rocco Burrell is another German painter from the Leipzig school. This work of his from the early 2000s is really great to me. I really love how his figures almost feel confined inside this space, almost as if they are part of the furniture or another pattern that's being constructed around them. And the narrative is very ambiguous. We can't really tell who these figures are exactly or what is happening inside that. And it gives a lot of room for the viewer to try and fill in some of the gaps inside that space. This is another image by Rocco Burrell, and this one's called China. And I just think this is a great idea. This one figure kind of surrounded by all this flaming furniture and plates, and it's just a loss of gravity that is something that painting can do so easily and so free. Is something that photography or sculpture would have a much harder time conveying with any kind of sense of believability, and we're able to do this just as a kind of matter of course. And I think that's something fun to think about as a painter. What are the things that you would just like to see, and how can you make that happen? Dirk Schreiber is one more German. This painting of two smashed Volkswagens is really an interesting image, but I really love the way that he's been able to construct these almost real looking wrecks out of skeins of paint that are smeared and splattered. Look at how playful Schreiber is with the way that paint moves. We definitely see blurs that could be squeegee marks. We see splattered paint, but also this really perfectly done gradation from top to center at the horizon line. And all of that plays into the fact that Schreiber, while depicting a scene that is important to him, is ultimately making a painting with and about paint. One more painting from Schreiber, whose body of work over his career is very bizarre and moves in and out of all kinds of different subject matter. If you're to Google his name, you might see a dozen images that don't look anything like this painting or the one that came before it. He clearly is making decisions based on a kind of feel, a kind of color that is important to him, and not necessarily just sticking to one set of ideas as he moves. Tomas Noskowski is one of my very favorite abstract painters. He's American. He died just recently. And his paintings are modest in scale, something like 16 by 20 inches. And he does a lot of things that I think are really valuable as a painter. Number one, he never seems to repeat himself. He always is exploring what paint does and what layering can do, and new kinds of mark making, new kinds of shapes in his work. Also, as he would work, when he got a painting to a stage where he thought something looked really good, but he knew the painting wasn't done yet, he would step back and draw that painting at the stage. And I think that that's such a great idea. His drawing would then become a document of the painting at a stage that it would eventually move past, of course, as he painted over it. But then the drawing itself was a work of art that captured something that he saw in the painting at that one moment. His work tends to, the way that he talks about his work, at least in videos, suggests that his paintings are references, are abstract references to things that have happened in his day or in his life at the time, and that he might cling to a single moment that really stands out in his mind and then make an entire painting based on that. A masterful colorist. Every color he makes seems really specific, never generic. And I just love his forms, his shapes, and the kind of humility of his paintings. Chuck Close, of course, is a painter, an American painter that many of you might already know, very, very famous in the world. And he makes large scale paintings of people's faces. This is a self portrait. Um, Close was a very famous photorealistic painter in the late 1960s and 1970s in America. And then in late 1980s, 1988, he had a spinal embolism that left him confined to a wheelchair, and his paintings became much more painterly after that. This example of working from a grid is very particular to Close. He's been doing this for years and years. He makes about 3 of these huge paintings a year, and they are made up of, 1,000 tiny abstract paintings. This kind of pixelization of Chuck Close's paintings happened, I'll point out, way before the pixel was ever present in our lives. He was making these fragments before we were kind of consistently confronted with digital imagery. And it's also interesting to know that Chuck Close suffers from a form of face blindness, wherein he can't recognize people as they move. Basically, every time their face moves, it looks like a totally new person to him. And he points out that when an image is in a photographic form or a painted form and is still, then that doesn't happen. This could be some of the reason why he's chosen to spend his entire career painting people's faces. I'm not sure. Venezuelan-born Arturo Herrera makes really interesting mixed media work, paintings, collages, drawings, felted sculptures. He's really, really well known for using found imagery and pop cultural imagery. And this collage, which you can probably tell is of Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians. And yet he, by cutting it up and segmenting it out and reapplying it to a new surface, is in many ways changing the original meaning of this piece, so that we are kind of left with this fragmented piece of pop culture turned into almost a reference point for modernist abstraction. Another piece by Herrera that does something a little similar with the image of Mickey Mouse, and then overlaid onto this winter cartoon landscape. And we kind of almost see like a melancholic approach to subject matter because of that. This feels sad or supplicant in some way. The The British painter Gary Hume was associated with the YBA artists, the Young British Artists of the 1990s. There were a handful of painters in that crew, but other really famous British artists of that kind of loose affiliation would be Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, Chris O'Feely. And Hume is a painter who is really well known for making these very slick paintings on aluminum out of pre-mixed industrial or household paints. So he lays the painting flat and he applies it with basically an industrial foam brush, and then that surface becomes this really glassine enameled surface. His work sometimes has really recognizable forms in it, like flowers, but also can be very abstracted to the point of kind of questioning what exactly is happening inside that space. Another interesting approach to this division between abstraction or representation that we're kind of constantly confronting in painting. Thank you. Please continue in part 3.